Say hello to everybody on the internet.
Hello, internet.
Yeah, okay, that was really enthusiastic. Hello, internet. All right, here we go. Going full screen. I knew you were going to do that. I meant that last time. So by default, PowerPoint, if you've got two PowerPoint, use one as because that's the one that's on my Hangout. So everybody was seeing the wrong display. So now I've duplicated it. Okay. Willkommen. So this is the first of a number of sessions I'm planning on doing that I'm calling software retrospectives. And all I really mean by that is looking back on interesting ideas that have been around for a while that maybe you aren't that familiar with or you haven't had much exposure to, or just, that I think are interesting and useful for you to be exposed to. So I'm thinking potentially about maybe doing something on the Mythical Man Month and or No Silver Bullet or Death March, those kinds of things. So quite often these are going to be based on a book, and in this case it's domain-driven design. And I'm sort of playing with the format, so I'm going to try and give this presentation as quickly as I can. There's quite a lot of information to be rammed into it, and then what I really want to do is have a bit of a Q&A discussion, get your thoughts and encourage some thinking rather than just spout at you. But if I can fit it all in now, I'll be quite surprised. So there you go. This is a bit of a beta test. So if I can get a few shows of hands first. First of all, who's heard of domain-driven design? Excellent. Who thinks they know what it is? Obviously, Alex. Yeah. And has anybody ever done any projects in a domain-driven design style? All right. So I better get it right then, eh? So start out by saying, what is DDD? Okay, so this is my description. DDD is a software design method for business-oriented software systems. Okay, I want to make the point, it's not one of the DDs like TDD, BDD, or FDD, despite it having DD in its name. It really is aimed and pitched at a higher level than those things. So TDD is about how you develop, it's test-driven development. It's about the way in which you code. Now, it is a design tool, but it's about designing while you code, whereas DDD is more of a design philosophy, should we say, a design method, and it has impacts on how you code, but you could do a DDD project using TDD. I mean, there are limits on that, because if you view TDD as a kind of an evolutionary process out of which your design evolves, you still have to make sure your design follows the basic shape and rules of DDD, but you could still do it in a TDD manner. So it's not the same thing. It's not really in opposition to that. It's maybe more in opposition to things like binding grids on pages to data sources, zero-tier applications, to some extent maybe SOA even, although the two can be complementary. So DDD is fundamentally about either the business or what we sometimes call the problem domain, and that's an interesting word that I'll expand on a bit more later. But the key is in the name. Software that doesn't have a clear domain, so I'm thinking like tools, utilities, little bits of code that you're writing that aren't really business oriented and don't reflect a business domain or a business problem that has a language you can use to describe it, aren't really something you would use DDD for. There are practices and lessons within DDD that you can apply universally if you like them, but DDD itself is designed for a particular kind of systems. It's kind of for enterprise, it's for business systems, line of business, quite a lot like the sort of stuff that we do here. DDD influences all parts of a project, not just the design and the build part, the architecture, the requirements and specification. Everybody needs to participate in the process and use what's going to be called the ubiquitous language. So it's not just for coders. Project managers, product owners, stakeholders would all have a role to play in a DDD project, because you all have to speak the same language and use the same terminology and understand the steps that you go through and what a domain model is and how the domain model fits together. So that's probably really not very clear at all. So the question is, what is DDD? And it's a set of processes, it's a library of patterns, it's a vocabulary of software design, it's a wellspring of experience from the people that came up with the ideas, it's a state of mind. I'd even go as far as to say it's a way of life. Yeah, it's all things to all men, really. It is, but at the same time, it's kind of what you choose to make it. So, okay, what do I mean? I'm using the word domain a lot. So, what do I mean when I talk about domains? So, a domain describes the language, concepts, actors, processes, and rules of a business. A description of the problem space that the business occupies. I'll try to find some concrete examples. So, in publishing, you have the idea of publication, of an issue, of articles and pages, and then things that you do. We publish issues, we print articles, we lay out pages. These are all part of what you would call the ubiquitous language of the publishing domain. And the language is the key to DDD and to effective domain modeling, is that because the language should directly reflect the way you design the software, and the things that you build should directly reflect the language of the domain. So it should be natural when you're talking to a person who's an expert in the business domain but knows nothing about software. When you start talking about the entities that you have, that should feel natural to them because they already understand what they are. The fact you've modeled them in software using classes and interfaces doesn't matter to them, but they understand what they are and what they do and the way in which they interact. And the way in which they interact in the software is the same as the way in which they interact in the real world. So, within the domain, we're going to model things as entities and services and other software concepts. But these things should be natural to a person who's not technical but is a domain expert. So if you like, the purpose of DDD is to effectively model the domain of a business, or that part of it relevant to the system you're doing, in OO terms. I want to stress that it is fundamentally an OO design methodology. You really couldn't do DDD very well in a non-OO environment. And when I say environment, not necessarily a language, but you can see examples of it using OO languages in a kind of a non-OO way. Depending on how you do it, like fat clients connecting to RESTful APIs, if there's nothing behind the API other than the call to a database, it isn't really OO, really. And it wouldn't work with DDD. Where did it come from? The ideas, as written down, originated in the book, Domain-Driven Designs, Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software. I brought my iPad in, literally just so I could show you that. There you go. That's the cover. I used to have the physical book, but I left it at my last company. It is available on Kindle. It's quite expensive. It's like 32 quid, but I do recommend that you get it if you're interested. I will try and get a copy for the office if I can persuade Jonathan to splash out on it. And there's a couple of other books that I think are interesting as well that I'll talk about later. I mean, a lot of these ideas were already in circulation. Evans formalized them. He gave them his own names. He ordered them into a comprehensive set of advice. But it's not like these ideas are all completely new. He didn't really invent anything in that sense. First edition of the book was published in 2003 during what I'm calling the first wave of Java dominance. So if you remember the glory days, it was when Java was about it for enterprise OO, if you didn't want to get into the realms of C++ and transaction server, and .NET was still very much in the nascent stage and it wasn't taken particularly seriously. So all the examples and it's all in Java, but it's very comprehensible to a .NET person. Influences behind it include Martin Fowler, the whole ThoughtWorks crowd, those sorts of people, Kent Beck, Walt Cunningham, the Agile movement. Evans talks a lot about XP, extreme programming, in the book. Scrum hadn't really been coined as a term then, but if you're familiar with the ideas of extreme programming, I mean, Scrum basically uses XP as its programming practices anyway, and then layers a sort of a project management methodology on top of it. And the whole sort of patterns and practices enterprise community. So I want to make the point again that DDD is strongly tied to the enterprise movement, and that's probably one of the reasons it's maybe starting to fall out of fashion a little bit, because I think the whole enterprisey way of doing things is seen as a little bit old-fashioned and not down with the kids. But it still has, I think, important lessons to teach us. So let's go through the key concepts in DDD pretty quickly. There are more than this, but these are the top level ones that I think are probably the most important. And these are they: domain model, ubiquitous language, entities of value objects, aggregates and aggregate roots, repositories, factories, services, modules, and bounded contexts. And some of those will sound familiar and some of those won't. We all probably know what factories are, we probably know what entities are, and value object sounds like something we ought to know what they are. But they all have their own little spin in DDD. And again, part of the thing about using the language is that you need to know what DDD defines them as in order to be able to use them correctly. So a domain model, we define that as the entirety of the objects and services that make up the model of the business domain. That probably sounds a bit circular, but I mean that genuinely, in that is all that is in the domain model. It's the model of the business domain. Anything that isn't involved in modeling the business domain should not be in the domain model. So there may well be layers and components outside the domain model in your system, but they should not represent business objects or processes or actors. They should live inside the domain, and things that are not about that should live outside and relate to it. So a domain model should be cohesive. It's strongly coupled at a conceptual level, but it doesn't have to be implemented monolithically. So it doesn't have to be in one big class library. It doesn't have to be in one project or application. You could spread your model across multiple projects. You could have implementations that are decoupled. You can use IOC, you can use DI, you can inject stuff. You could, as an example, fetch entities from a repository, but the repository may use SOA and web services to go away and get the data and turn them into objects and give them to you. You don't have to care about that sort of stuff. But there should be nothing in the domain model that doesn't belong there. Okay, so concepts outside the domain should be kept outside the domain model, and that includes the UI, so MVC and things like that, and storage and persistence. Those are not things that belong inside the domain model. They have to plug in, but they shouldn't be exposed at your domain model. They shouldn't be concerns of your domain objects, at least not visible public concerns. Ubiquitous language. This is possibly the most important thing in the Evans book. I define this as an agreed upon set of terms to describe the concepts of the domain. And the key thing is that you must use the terminology that's used by your business. So you separate it into what we call nouns and verbs. Nouns are things, verbs are processes, nouns are entities, verbs are actions. You should be able to take any business domain and break it down into a series of things and a series of processes fundamentally. And to avoid ambiguity, there should be no adjectives and no adverbs. By which I mean that a thing is a thing. There's more than one kind of thing. There are two different kinds of things. Objects and methods should be named from the ubiquitous language, so carry all the way through to your code to the lowest level. Always refer to things in the same manner. That way, it should be clear to everybody, from the coder through the QAs, through the project managers to the product owner, what things are and what they're about. Don't bend the naming. Naming is really key, really important to have a comprehensible domain model. And everybody needs to use the ubiquitous language without deviation, invention, or substitution. The worst thing you can do is start as a dev team, and start randomly making up new terms for stuff. If you've created something that's entirely new and you need a name for it, go and ask the domain expert what they would call this, because they're the person that understands the domain. So your domain expert should be a key part of your project team. They can't just be somebody you see once a month. There has to be somebody that's involved day in and day out, which is often difficult in many businesses to get the time for those people. But you need that person if you can do DDD properly, because they're the ones that actually understand the domain. Unless you spend the months and months necessary to get to that level of familiarity with it yourself, and even then I doubt that you will, then you need somebody who's not a coder as part of your project team. So entities. Entities are objects that describe a noun in the ubiquitous language that has identity and state. So examples would be a user, an account, publication, an issue, an order. These are all things that have some identity, and the most important thing about them is their identity that distinguishes them from other things. So entities are created by factories in DDD and queried from repositories. That's pretty conventional, right? But the most important thing distinguishing entities is their identity. Thus, two people with the same name are not the same person. They have an identity that's separate from the name. The name is a value, but they have identity. The identity is typically significant outside the software itself. So a book will be identified uniquely by the ISBN rather than, say, a GUID or even its name, because you can get multiple books with the same name. Yeah. So I suppose it's a bit like selecting a decent primary key in a database, but you need to know what it is with an entity that distinguishes it from other entities that may have the same values. Just because an object has an ID does not make it an entity. That's not what makes an entity, although all entities must have a meaningful ID. Yeah? You can use other properties of the entity to find or refer to it. That's fine. Query your repository to find a person by name or by their email address or something. You don't have to do everything by ID, but any entity has to have an ID that it can be distinguished by. Value objects, on the other hand, contrasted with that, which we should not confuse with value types, by the way, it's an object in the domain that has no identity or meaningful state. So it's distinguished only by its values. And an example would be an address is actually a controversial one. There's in the book itself, it gives you a point to say an address can actually be either a value object or an entity, depending on the context in which you're looking at it. But generally speaking, if you're working at a system, you've got users and the user has an address, the address has no identity separate from the user, it's just where they live. Now, you could have multiple users living at the same address. That's fine, you can map that. But again, the address has no identity of its own. Its identity is its value, because the value is what the address is. So the only way you'd ever refer to it is by the address. And any object that you would create just to pass values around in DDD would be a value object. And value objects are often, and I think probably should be, immutable. They may even be singletons. You might have a collection of value objects, like, list of countries that you refer to from different parts of the application. No sense in duplicating that, as long as you're not, because they're read-only. You just need to be able to refer to the properties of the country, so you can do that as a singleton object. Child objects of entities will often be value objects. So like I say, a user would have an address. But then child objects of entities can also be other entities as well. So all that really distinguishes them, and I must admit, when I started doing DDD, I struggled a lot thinking, should this be an entity, should this be a value object? And ultimately, the conclusion I came to, doesn't really matter at the end of the day. As long as you know what to call it, it's fine. There's no point, as you'll see when we look at some code later on, I didn't actually bend the implementation to make entities and value objects look semantically different. I just, in my head go, that's an entity, that isn't. Aggregates and aggregate roots. Okay, so aggregates in DDD are clusters of related objects that are treated as a unit. So the canonical example is the car has wheels and wheels have tires. And that whole unit of cars, wheels, and tires is an aggregate. Generally speaking, the aggregate would be persisted or retrieved together. So it's a set of things that generally stay together and are dealt with together. And the aggregate root is the object in that cluster that other objects will refer to. So it's like it's the starting point. So again, example, an account owns users, users own subscriptions. So the way to get programmatically from nowhere to a particular subscription is via the account, via the user to the subscription. What you shouldn't be doing is querying a subscription directly and using it directly. You should always be going through the account of the user that own it, because you access things through the aggregate root. So I've said that, account.users by name andyhow.subscriptions.count. That'd be a pattern that you'd see quite frequently in DDD. Aggregates obviously can have other aggregates as children or as parents. So it's not like it's a self-contained thing and everything in there is part of the same aggregate. They can connect together, but for any given aggregate, you can go here. Here's the set of stuff, and here's the root, and this is the way I should talk to it through the root. And generally speaking, you will structure your classes in such a way that that's the only way you can, by changing your constructor access levels and making it impossible to retrieve stuff directly from repositories. You can enforce that up to a point. Evans has opinions about that. He talks about a system he saw being built where everything was done through traversal from a global route, and he really didn't like that. The interesting thing is that technology has moved on enough with ORMs and the way in which, and things like extension methods in .NET, that you actually can build a system that works almost entirely through traversal. And I'll show an example of that in a bit. Yeah.
Doesn't that violate the rule of Demeter by doing account.users by name subscription.count?
Might do.
Yeah. I mean, is that why is that? Because obviously, raw Demeter is a good thing to have, and I mean, it just seems why is that the accepted practice in DDD?
I think that protecting the integrity of the aggregate is perhaps seen as a more important goal. So, as a general principle, it's about state immutability and things like that. Generally speaking, when you build a DDD system, you shouldn't be able to do anything with that system that isn't valid in the domain context. So something shouldn't be mutable except through a business operation that makes sense. So by enforcing access to things through a predictable chain, you can apply the rules and the invariants as you go down. I mean, that's a noddy example, but yeah, it may not be the best example either. I just realised I didn't start this meeting. If I don't, then I'll get the room from Right. Well, that's not the email from Deco. Never mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But let's talk about that later on. Repositories. So repositories in DDD, we all know what a repository is, but DDD repositories are maybe slightly specialized. They're model data storage, but they do so in a domain-consistent manner. What I mean by that is that general purpose querying for any old object is not allowed. You shouldn't do it. You should just go, here's a repository, I can query it, I can get any old thing back. And if you do have a repository that works like that, you certainly shouldn't be exposing it at your API level to your end user, because again, they should only be able to get access to stuff through a process that makes sense in a business context. So repositories can return entities, or they can return metadata about entities. So it's okay to get counts of stuff and max and min values and things like that. The jury's out on whether it's okay to do things like projections and summaries and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know whether I'd be that bothered about it. The question is whether you could, if you could use a repository to get back an object in a form that could be used to break the rules of the domain, that would be bad. So my own personal philosophy is to try and keep the repositories as hidden from the outside as you can. As a general principle, value objects should be accessed only by traversal from the entities that own them. So you shouldn't be fetching them directly because, again, they have no identity. But specific cases I mentioned, like global chains of value objects. So it may be okay to use a repository to load those up front. And use the ubiquitous language. So another example, issue repository, like a fictional repository for getting issues, find by month and year. That's a valid business operation because an issue has a month and a year. And for a user, it might be finding by email rather than just a general query interface. And what I found is that in .NET Land, link to objects can be quite useful here. So I'll show an example of a repository that implements iQueryable, and which in so doing breaks some of those rules. I don't know in the Java world exactly how you would do these things. I mean, I'm not a Java guy, so got any Java people in the room? Moses at the back. Yeah, I don't know how you do some of these things in Java. I was talking to Nicola, who's there as well actually yesterday about link, and that Java doesn't really have a link equivalent.
We don't really have a true equivalent. There are some half-baked alternatives of APIs there. There was a promise of Java to bring it in, but it doesn't really quite fit in, and everything else is just half-baked.
Hopefully they'll get something better. But what I found in .NET is that, and this is what I meant about things moving on, is that things like link actually allow you to do some of the things that maybe Evans would frown upon in a way that I think is DDD consistent.
With would you break the domain to sort of validation of the domain repository you're using link?
Depends what you can do with a link is the short answer. If it's just generically iQueryable completely, then maybe you could. It's a philosophical question, but I won't talk about those things there. Factories. Factories are exactly what they sound like, and they supply new instances of entities. You shouldn't really be doing new entity. You should be getting them from a factory. Back in 2003, DI and IOC existed as concepts, but they weren't anywhere near as well known and thought about as they are today. So today, you'd probably just use an IOC container as your factory. No reason why not. Maybe wrap it in a factory method to make it look extra special. The factory then can enforce business rules and invariants around the creation of entities, which is the key thing. So generally speaking, I say you should never do a new entity, use the factory. If you need to create new entities inside an aggregate, so for example, an account needs to create a new user because a new user is signed up to the account, then you could have a factory method rather than having to use a factory class on the account at some form of non-public scope, and then stick your IOC in there, and you can call down to that and get back a new user object. Services. This is reasonably controversial in DDD. Services are where you put the behavior that doesn't fit conceptually into entities or value objects or actors or actions in the domain. You've got to be careful about what goes into a service, because it's very easy to go, oh, that behavior looks like it could be a service, but actually it belongs on an entity. And making those judgment calls is, I think, key to good domain modeling. I would not, by the way, profess to be a fantastic domain modeler. I've done a bit of it. I think I kind of understand basically how to do a decent domain model, but I'm sure when you look at my code later, you'll find lots that you want to criticize. It's not all my code, I'll point out. It's at least 5 people's code, but a lot of it's mine. Services, they must not have state, so there's one key thing. If it needs state, it should be in a service. They're not an excuse to inject non-domain behavior into the domain model either. So you wouldn't have an email service in your domain because sending email is an infrastructure concern, right? And it belongs outside the domain mode. But you might have a user notification service that uses the email service to send emails to users. That makes sense. So the notion of notifying a user when something happens, that's a domain concern because it's part of the business process. But you could, in theory, be sending them a letter or phoning them up or texting them or sending them an email. The fact that you're doing it via email doesn't really matter. Your user notification service can encapsulate that, and then your domain's concern is only that I've asked for the user to be notified, and now I know the user is being notified. Modules. We're starting to get into fuzzy territory here. So modules are conceptual devices that represent the division of the domain into self-contained parts. So isn't that just a namespace, right? Well, not exactly. So you might talk about the publication module, the order module, the custom module. These are sub-portions of the domain that kind of you can divide off and hang together. Module is not equal to aggregate. So you can't say this aggregate, like the user, the account and stuff. It's not as simple as that. The example that Evans gave is if the domain is a story, then a module is a chapter in the story. If that makes sense to you, great. Honestly, it doesn't make sense to me. Elements in the module should naturally fit together. They would generally be considered together when you're thinking about the business domain, particularly in non-technical terms. So when you're talking to your product owners and your domain experts and stuff, these are the terms you would use. Say, the publication module. They could be implemented as simply as namespaces or assemblies. They could be whole subsystems. They could be individual REST APIs. It doesn't matter. It's a conceptual division. A lot of what's in the DDD book is again about language. It's about how you describe things. The actual implementation of them doesn't matter that much as long as you can express it in a meaningful language. In small domains, there may be no meaningful separation of modules at all. Right, bounded context. Even I honestly do not think I understand what a bounded context is, so I've assembled this from the book. So sometimes the domain is large enough that it comprises more than one complete and consistent domain model, or can do. So the example that Evans gives, 2 teams split the work of building a large system between them, and each creates a model of their part of the domain. Because they're using the same ubiquitous language, the models are and should be compatible, but they're not directly connected. They use separate data stores. They each have dependencies on different services and infrastructure, but they're part of the same overall system. So we say that the work of each team forms a bounded context. So the model they're building, the dependencies they have, the data stores they use is all part of their context. They can work separately inside their own bounded context without worrying about what's going on inside the other bounded context or any of the other bounded contexts. They can consume each other's models, but they should only do so by published interfaces, which are not allowed to change. So the whole idea is to allow multiple teams to go away and work separately, but still keep the ubiquitous language and the purity of the main model intact, I think. Outside services integrate at the boundary, and there's a whole thing about context boundaries, but they're outside of the bounded context. They're considered outside the bounded context. Bounded context is not the same thing as module. as I've written, it's all very hysteric and hand wavy. I don't think you could do this for years and not have to worry about multi-bounded context unless you're working in everything. I honestly, it's the thing that does my head in the most about DDD. If anybody understands it better than me, then
it's more manageable this way. You split it into separate bounded contexts. So, as we said, different people can work on it at the same time. And if you like loading the whole context in memory, sometimes it's really, really slow. If you split it, improves performance as well. Yeah, sometimes it confuses me as well with aggregate. What's the difference between aggregate and bounded context? But yeah, I think that's what I know.
Cool. Yeah, that was my reaction as well. So the question is, do you have to do all this stuff? And I think, yeah, if you want to say that I'm doing DDD as written in the Evans book, then yeah, you do. But, and this is the thing with Scrum and Agile, all the great ideas, you can take it and you can make it your own. Okay, there are bits. Use the bits you like. You don't use the bits you don't like. Evolve it. Some ideas in DDD are clearly more important than others. Ubiquitous language is key. If you don't have this, it's not DDD in any form. I've said that I think it's fundamentally a restrictive practice in coding terms, that it's about stuff that you shouldn't let happen rather than the stuff that you should. So a lot of DDD is not about do this, it's about don't do this. You should keep objects properly organized in aggregates. Don't allow direct access to the value objects. Don't allow general purpose repositories, that sort of thing. I think that the strength lies in the concept of the domain model. And the notion of a domain model is not unique to DDD at all. It's been around forever, but the way that the DDD treats it, I think, it's obvious that Evans and the people like him are very good at domain modeling in a way that an awful lot of people just aren't. So a good domain model should naturally make sense in the context of your business, whereas a bad domain model tends not to. If you describe what you've built to a non-technical person who's an expert in that domain, and they go, you probably failed. You should avoid anemic domain models. Anyone heard that term before? That's a Fowlerism. It's basically, look at my domain model, isn't it fantastic? It's like, no, you've got 15 objects and they have a bunch of properties and no methods at all. You have no behavior. These are data transfer objects. DTOs are fine for certain things, but a domain model composed of DTOs, nah, it isn't a domain. Don't allow non-domain concerns to pollute the domain either. That's another key thing. Preserve the purity at all costs. Don't inject infrastructure concerns into domain. Of course, we all do it. I think the key takeaway is that it should not be a chore. It shouldn't be hard. It's supposed to improve your productivity, not make it hard. If it isn't working, then maybe the project you set out to do wasn't really a good candidate for doing DDD in the first place. Okay. This is the bit I'm dreading. I'm actually going to show you some code that I wrote. So this is, I'm going to show you a DDD-ish system design. And I want to stress the ish because a lot of those rules I've just been talking about? Yeah, I didn't follow those. But I took quite a lot of ideas from the book, and this is a system from my previous company. So obviously you never saw this. But it's a large, relatively complicated system. It's basically, I used to work at the RICS, Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and my team built software as a service applications for surveyors. So this particular application, if you buy a house, you get a surveyor's report on the house that you're thinking about buying. Typically, you'll get the RICS home buyer report. So this was a tool that was designed for the automation of the production of home buyer reports and things like it. Not particularly interesting as an actual domain, but it is a clear domain that has a clear language about it and something that we could break down and describe it in a good meaty way. So I tried to apply DDD-ish principles to this build. Having said that, a lot of people worked on this code and some of it is not as good as other bits. So I'll just show you the bits I actually like. You can ignore most of these projects. Most of these projects are just support projects. But the core is really where the domain model lives. So this is the bit where we find out the font is far too small. Yeah, that's a bit small. That good? Okay. So let me just close that down. So I have this this class here called an account, and this is an example of an aggregate root. So the account is the root of a hierarchy that includes users and other bits and pieces. You can ignore some of the detail of it. I've got a repository implementation here now. It is yeah, it's not really a DDD repository, to be brutally honest. It does allow you to do general purpose querying, but only for a particular type at a time. It was easier to do it that way, but we do have some examples of more specialized repositories. So, for example, there's this additional find for user by email method that is domain specific, or in the user repository we have get by email. We have check if it exists. These are all additions onto the base repository. So you can see that we were starting to come up with a kind of a language for the repository and actions with it. But I don't think we ever went as far as I would have been comfortable with. What else can I show you? Yeah, so accounts own users. They also own addresses. So an account in this model has addresses. So account belongs to a company, and a company obviously has an address where its head office is, but it may have more than one, so it can have a collection of addresses, because a surveying company will often have more than one office. And then it has users that belong to the account that again can belong to one or more of these offices. So users also have addresses. So addresses, although address is a value object, it's become a shared thing in that a single address can have meaning both for an account but also for a user, but doesn't necessarily have to apply to both. Yeah. And then we have other things like contacts and company documents and stuff like that, which again all makes sense in the ubiquitous language of the domain. So we have subscriptions, we have phrases, we have folders, we have forms, sales, contacts, customer emails. These are all entities, and they all have an identity, and they all have some notion of state, and they get persisted, and they get retrieved through stuff, but they're all managed by this aggregate root. So I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to collapse. Collapse the definitions. Okay, so I've scrolled down a bit further. So now you get into some methods, and these methods represent valid actions in the domain. So adding a company document, the account owns the process of adding a company document because the account owns the company documents. I wouldn't use a service for that, but it needs to be controlled by the account because that's where it belongs. Adding folders, moving forms, copying forms, adding addresses and contacts. There's dozens of these methods. And again, they all make sense as actions in the domain, and they're all checked. So within this design, you have kind of a public API, and then you have an internal API. So the public API enforces the invariants and the rules of the domain. So a classic example of that, if I look at the user object, is changing password. So one of the rules about changing passwords is that you can't change your password without supplying your old password. Yeah. So in this case, that's just enforced by having the old password as part of the API and actually doing the check there and then. But you notice that if the password validates, it's then calling a method called set password. So set password is part of the internal API, which just changes the password. And if you've got, so if inside you've got a valid case for just changing the password, you can do it. But what you don't do is expose that API publicly, because that would be an invalid operation. It doesn't make sense in the business domain. You can't change your password unless you know your existing password. Obviously, if you want to, there's also a mechanism in here for resetting passwords as well. So it's not like if you forget your password, you can never log in again. But it will be invalid to just have a method to change the password that any old consumer of the code could call. And then, yeah, so we actually look down to the set password later on. Then the set password is actually doing all the hard work of changing the password. It's generating assaults, hashing the password, and so on and so forth. But you can't call that directly because it's internal. It's protected internal. In case you're wondering why everything's virtual, it's because this system uses in Hibernate. And if you want your object to be proxyable in Hibernate, all your methods have to be virtual. Unlike Java, obviously, where methods are virtual by default. So user, again, is an aggregate root because a user owns things that you should only navigate to. So user has an address. A user also has, what am I trying to find?
That's still the internal API.
Well, all the stuff that's public is public, obviously, and all the stuff that's internal is internal. So it's all separated out. So this is the public stuff now. So for example, okay, so if a user is suspended or pending, public get you can see that status, but obviously protect internal set, you can't just flip that bit yourself. In order to suspend the user, the account has to suspend the user. So the account has a method on called suspend user, which then causes that to get changed. But it will be invalid for you as a consumer of this class to be able to go, is suspended equals true. And then, yeah, there's nothing particularly special about that. We do that sort of stuff all the time. But one of the things that I found when doing DDD was that more and more my classes became immutable, and all of my state was changing through methods that were actually validated and had their invariants checked. There's also a kind of a rule system. So I think you probably saw earlier on the change password, wherever it's gone. This attribute here represents a rule. So that's automatic. That's checking that this parameter is actually matches the password rules. So we found that by abstracting that stuff out, and that's done using PostSharp with AOP. By taking that stuff out, you could avoid polluting the domain with all these checks, and it's just a repeatable check that you can put in that sort of becomes an automatic side effect. Some people might like that. Here's how the rule's done. So it's got this thing called a rule attribute, and then we build a rule, and it's just a lambda basically. So it gets the parameter in, it checks. Wow, that's password.length is greater than or equal to 6 is for strong enough. That's really good. I blame the business for that. So that's some examples of DDD in action in some of my code. I could drill through more code, but really it's all more or less the same. It's the key takeaways for me were restrict your public APIs so that consumers of the code can only do what is valid in a business context. Validate those APIs so that everything that gets applied to the API is checked to make sure it's valid in the business context. Deny direct access to the repositories to consuming code. So the only way to get that stuff is by traversal. So there's a series of stuff here in the environment. This is a pattern that we used a lot in my last place. Some people don't like this, so I shall listen for your disapproval. We used a pattern called ambient context. Well, aware of ambient context? If you've seen HTTP context.current, which will then get back the current HTTP request stuff, and it's ambient in the sense that you literally just call HTTP context.current. You don't have to new anything or run any operations. It's just there for you to get at. So we did something similar, and we have a context object which lets you get access to stuff. So you would in this case go Phoenix is the code name for the project. You go Phoenix context.current, and then you would get back the Phoenix context object, and that has within it references to a session object, to the account that's currently logged on, and to the user that's currently logged on. So you actually, in this system, you can't use the public API until you've logged on, because you can't get access to the API except through the context, and the context doesn't exist until you've logged on successfully. So I'm even denying you the ability to do anything until you've provided valid credentials. And again, for me, that was a takeaway of what I learned from the DDD book, that this is a really good way of enforcing your domain rules. And as a general principle, this has all been built quite defensively. But equally, there's no distinguishing between entities and value objects, except you kind of know which one. But because they're all persisted through the same mechanism, then every object, so the user object being a simple example, inherits from a persistent object base object, and that inherits from a persistent object base object that's in our in-house persistence framework, which is just a wraparound in Hibernate. But again, it applies sort of, I keep saying DDD-ish, it's not really. It applies repository semantics around in Hibernate. So if you've used it in Hibernate before, you know, in Hibernate is, again, session-based. So you create a session and you query into the session and you get stuff back. But I wanted to avoid that because you weren't supposed to have a general purpose repository. So instead, it's wrapped in my repository implementation, which then implements iQueryable. And so you can only do stuff that's valid in the context of the iQueryable. And that lets me jump in and put certain rules in there. So a classic as well. I mean, I can show some consuming code. And we'll finish this in a minute. So here's a controller from the actual website that uses this thing. So you see, this is, we're interacting with this current.account logo set. Actually, that's bad. Shouldn't be doing that. That's because somebody else wrote. I can blame all the bad things in this on other people. It's great. I love it. Yeah. So Phoenix context.account.delete address that's a complete business action that will cause a whole cascade of events that will eventually end up in Hibernate deleting that address from the database. But you don't have to care about that concern at this level because you just issue the command and it's done. And each bit is then split out, and it's easily, well, within reason it's easily decouplable because with our persistence framework, you could in theory inject another engine underneath. It wouldn't be that hard to do. I wouldn't hold this up as an example of fantastic architecture. Some of it's a little bit old-fashioned by today's standards, but it's something that we use for a number of years repeatedly across several different systems. Some of these subsystems were reused in multiple places, but this actual architectural model was reused in several systems. It's pretty successful. We had pretty low defect rate. The business, generally speaking, was pretty happy with it, and they felt like they understood how it worked. So our interactions with the domain experts were pretty fruitful, and my team quite enjoyed working in this manner until they, caught the bug of Angular and REST APIs and stuff, which they're all off doing. But again, these are the learnings that we took from DD. Other people would have taken different learnings and would have done things in, I imagine, very different ways. But this has certainly influenced the way that I build software. And I do things differently if I was doing it differently. But today, they wouldn't be that different. I'd still follow a lot of these rules. And so if you watch when I code in dojos and stuff, I tend to follow a lot of these rules anyway. Just I've absorbed them and I like to reuse them. Anyway, so that's some code. I'm happy to show people more code if you really want to look at more later on. But what I really want to do now, he says, go back to slides, is do some questions. So how we need for time? We've got 8 minutes.
In one of these slides, you mentioned that email service is not part of the service, let's say, in the domain model.
Yeah.
And next, we said that it should not even be part of the domain model. It should still be part of the domain model, if not the services. But
I would
keep them as like infrastructure concerns as part of your domain model.
I wouldn't put them as part of my domain model. I would and did have a separate library for those sorts of things. So although you can instantiate the objects and use them, they're still outside the scope of the actual domain model. So in that particular example, everything inside rcs.phoenix.core is the domain model effectively. And then the mail service would live in rcs.phoenix.utilities, I think.
And if you create them as external libraries, then you have to implement an additional layer called facade layer. So if you keep them inside, you wouldn't have to worry about all this.
You wouldn't, but then I talked about like a user notification service. That would effectively be the facade.
Yeah,
in my world. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I'm not a DDD purist. I like the ideas, but I think I think Evans makes quite a lot of work for himself. And I think on the scale of systems he was working with, that probably made sense. The scale of stuff I was working with, I mean, it was large enough to require a team of 3 people, but it's not huge. I'd say some of the stuff we do here at Euromoney is quite a lot bigger than the stuff that I did in my last job. Some of it's quite a lot smaller. So, if you look around at the stuff that we do in-house, things that might actually make sense as DDD projects, I mean, Delphi, maybe, aspects of Delphi. Don't know. What do people think? Titan, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I personally like to have a strong middle tier and a strong domain model in most of what I do. Obviously, in some cases there is no meaningful domain, but when that happens, I just tend to make one up. That's my own personal fetish, but I like designing that way. It makes sense to me, and so I take it. I maybe use it in places where it's not entirely advisable, but I'm definitely not a purist. I mean, you've also got experience of building systems in DDD. Would you say that you were following a fairly strict DDD process by the book?
Yeah, and plus our solution was very, we were following onion architecture. Very perfect. Our solution was actually beautifully designed. Everything was really organized. We had different layers inside the solution layer. Our interfaces, classes, models, everything is separate.
Was this here or was this a previous?
It's not really.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be here.
I've had some toy projects that did like very little, not as detailed as the one we just did. It's slightly more modern, I would say. But yeah.
I'd be interested in having a look like. I mean, if other people would be interested in having a look at some of that stuff. If there's stuff that you can share, I'd be very interested because I think the more we can pick up, the more perspectives we get on this, the better. Does anybody see anything in that interests them or makes them think I could maybe do some of that in my code, or anything that you violently reject and think that's the stupidest ideas that stupid ideas were invented?
And I think some of the logic in the identity is not in, I think, coming up with some stuff in our service. I suppose that stuff it relates to the actions that relate specific to our industry. Duplication of stuff in services.
Yeah. I mean, that whole architecture went through many iterations, and if I'd shown you a much earlier version of the code, I had entity-based classes and value object-based classes, and yes, more things in the service layer, and yeah, it was much more strongly decoupled as well and connected via IOC. In the end, for that application, just didn't need it, so I dropped a container. I was using Unity. I dumped that. It's simplified a lot over the years, especially because it was being worked on with multiple coders with different sort of levels of experience. But in my last place, what tended to happen was that I would quite often write the core API, or me and maybe one or two of the other guys would be responsible for that, and then other people on the team would generally be writing the web pages and doing the MVC side of things. And it was a genuine kind of provider-consumer relationship. Not that they couldn't get involved in that, but we took the view that sort of the more junior people on the team would start out consuming the code that had already been written rather than originating libraries of their own. And that way, when they came to actually writing their own stuff, they were already deeply indoctrinated in the way that we did things. And it seemed to work out reasonably well. Certainly some of the people that I hired have gone on to bigger and better things. And will probably turn around and say, my idea's rubbish, but they're just ungrateful children, what can I say? Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, ideas?
Yeah, I recently started writing more richer domain models, but I must confess, up until recently, I was doing lots of anemic domain models. And I think one of the reasons why is because things like an entity framework generates anemic domains for you. So how do you overcome that? Is one way to then allow entity framework to create an anemic domain model, and maybe then have another domain model on top of that that sort of maps between the two, and then have I think entity framework has a force and has a role to play in that sort of way of coding.
I think it does. Actually, I think the whole kind of Microsoft recommended coding style in many ways, well, there is no one Microsoft style, right? There's all kinds of different areas in Microsoft, and depending on who it's coming from, it's all going to look very different. And there are some really, really good OO practitioners in Microsoft, but there are also, there are guys who think that connecting a data grid to a data source and you're done. I mean, RAD used to be very much their bread and butter in the VB days, and I'm not surprised that there's still a lot of sample panels like that. You're right about Entity Framework. I am not a big fan of Entity Framework. I know that's slightly heretical around here. I am a big fan of Hibernate. But I mean, in the case of Entity Framework, okay, if you're using EF to generate if you're going code first and generating your entities, there's nothing to stop you taking what EF has produced for you and then starting to add behavior to them. You can take it and evolve. Think of it as a starting point. DTOs absolutely have a role, and not uncommon if I'm building a system that has relatively large, complicated entities that have child entities, and you obviously don't want to be loading all of that data at one go because you just ain't going to need it. You can either go for the lazy loading option and say, I get a skeleton, and as I refer to things, the rest of the data is automatically loaded, which can work, but then you get into territory of what they call select n+1, where you get back a collection of things that each have a property. You get all the things in one query, but then you iterate through all those things, painting that one property onto a form, except that in order to get that property, you have to lazily load some of the data. So it's like first object issues a query, second object issues a query, and it says query, and then your query load explodes. And some people would deal with that by eager loading stuff up front or by projections, or you could just create what amounts to a DTO that just contains, that's a representation of the domain object, just containing the bits you need. But then ultimately, what's the difference between that and the view model? DTO view model. DTOs, I guess, come into their own more when you're maybe in an SOA context and you've got to pass stuff over the wire. I mean, you can serialize, when you serialize stuff to JSON, it's not like the methods go with it anyway. So they become DTOs in a sense. I can understand why they're popular, and it seems like a lot less hassle in many ways. But yeah, Fowler in particular has a real bee in his bonnet about that. And, it's like the whole point of object-oriented programming was that data and behavior go together. That's what. And if you're not going to do it, you might as well just do procedural. And okay, I think Fowler can be a bit of an extremist from time to time, but I like to chart the middle course. But yeah, I like my domain objects to be rich and expressive and not generally DTOs. And that's why, when it comes to persistence, I like to use an ORM that will take that problem away from me. And generally speaking, for me, Entity Framework is not it. But having said that, I've never used Entity Framework commercially in anger. So, maybe other people in here that have used it a lot can tell me it's actually wonderful and beautiful and fantastic. Anybody want to stand up for AEF? There you go. Rob Ayres has said it sucks, and Rob is the authority on this. So it does, but then Hibernate is much more mature and complete. I mean, one of the reasons why there's not an awful lot being added to in Hibernate is you don't need to add an awful lot to it. It does what it says in the tin. Really, I mean, Hibernate itself is not really doing much, is it? There's sort of ways to do code first, but Hibernate isn't like EF in that sense. There are code generators and stuff for it, but I mean, I don't know if anybody else in the room got any Hibernate experience. I know you have, Rob. So for myself, when I have done in Hibernate, I tend to evolve the objects and the data model in parallel, unless I'm mapping to a legacy database or something that's already known. I actually tend, perhaps this may be heresy, to start with data tables first. So I shall build some data tables to represent the data I know I'm going to store, and then start writing objects. And the two, it's a ping pong, one to the other as I evolve. I don't use generators to do that, but horses for courses, really. It's how you want to do it, whatever's more effective for you. You can't get away from Entity Framework in Euromoney because we use it everywhere. So, and Microsoft is, as you rightly point out, Andrew, Microsoft is spending a lot of money on it, trying to make it better. I don't know. Orms are a bit old-fashioned now. Aren't micro orms the thing? Like Dapper. I've used Dapper. I can show you some source code that uses Dapper. Dapper, biggest pain of my life. It's all the pain of writing SQL, along with the restrictions of using an ORM. I mean, seriously, all Dapper really does for you is let you write SQL queries and auto map the results to objects. And even it doesn't do a great job of that either, I don't think. I mean, the whole reason I used ORMs was to get away from writing SQL in the first place, because SQL is a horrible language. I'm sorry. Nobody in their right minds other than Vaughan wants to do SQL, so that's what ORMs are for, I think. I don't know. Okay, well, we're probably out of time. I think what we'd say in terms of the experiment is that I talked too much and we didn't have enough time for Q&A. So next time, we need to keep the presentation to 30 minutes. So we've got proper time for Q&A. But in principle, are people up for more of this? Did we learn anything useful today? Or excellent. Then I shall consider my time well spent. If you've got any questions for me, by all means come and ask me. And yeah, so I'd love to see some of your source code. And yeah, let's get a discussion going. Maybe do a DDD room on HipChat or something. I recommend you read the book if you haven't. You get it on Kindle. I'll try and get a copy for the office. There's a lovely book I discovered called Implementing Domain-Driven Design by Vaughan Vernon, which is more up to date. So I think it was written about 3-4 years ago, and it incorporates a lot of the learning that's been done by the DDD community between the time the original book came out and now. And in many ways, it does a better job, I think, of explaining what DDD is or maybe should be in a more modern context. And certainly, it's a much more concrete set of examples because lots of code samples and showing how he does it. So you may even want to read that one first. But they're definitely both worth having. I bought them both on Kindle yesterday and discovered I'd already bought Domain-Driven Design on Kindle a couple of years ago, so now I've got 2 copies on Kindle, which is great. There's a site called dddcommunity.org, which is dedicated to all things DDD, pretty good starting point. And there's actually quite an active set of questions and answers on Stack Overflow under the Domain-Driven Design tag. Some of it's quite noddy, but there's some useful nuggets to be gained there if you're interested in doing a bit more research. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Yes.
And thank you to the people on the internet as well.